The moment they stopped her, they were absolutely certain she was guilty. The fluorescent lights inside the small convenience store hummed softly as customers froze in place, sensing something was about to unfold that did not belong in an ordinary afternoon. Angela Brooks stood near the checkout counter holding a simple basket with bottled water, fruit, and a small stack of groceries, her posture calm, her expression composed in a way that did not match the tension building around her. She had not raised her voice, had not moved aggressively, and yet something about the way the cashier hesitated while pointing at the receipt had already shifted the atmosphere. A misunderstanding over a payment scan had escalated in seconds into a phone call that no one needed to make, but someone had. The assumption had already been formed before the truth even had a chance to speak. Outside, the sound of a patrol car pulling into the parking lot cut through the quiet evening air, and within moments Officer Daniel Carter stepped inside with the kind of presence that immediately changed how people stood, how they breathed, how they looked away. He scanned the scene quickly, his eyes locking on Angela as if the conclusion had already been written before he arrived. The cashier spoke in a rushed tone, mentioning suspicious behavior and possible theft attempt, words that carried more weight than evidence. Angela slowly placed her basket on the counter and turned slightly toward the officer, her movements deliberate, controlled, almost too calm for what others expected. Carter approached with professional authority, his voice firm as he asked her to explain what was in her possession and why there had been an issue at checkout. Around them, customers pulled out their phones, not yet recording but already anticipating a moment they believed they understood. Angela did not argue. She did not panic. She simply looked at the receipt, then at the cashier, then at the officer, as if she was processing a pattern of assumptions that she had seen before in places like this. Carter repeated his questions, slightly sharper this time, interpreting her silence as resistance rather than restraint. The store felt smaller with every passing second, every person waiting for confirmation of a story that had not been proven. Angela finally spoke, her voice steady, low, and precise, stating that there must be an error in the transaction and that she had used her card as she always did. But the officer had already shifted into procedure mode, asking her to provide identification while subtly signaling that compliance would determine how the situation escalated. The air grew heavier, not from conflict, but from expectation, as though everyone present had already decided which version of reality they preferred. Angela reached slowly into her bag, not rushed, not defensive, and the entire room seemed to lean forward in anticipation. What she pulled out would not match anyone's assumptions in that moment. And yet no one in the room was prepared for how quickly the balance of authority could collapse when truth finally decided to reveal itself. The silence that followed Angela Brooks placing her bag on the counter felt heavier than any raised voice could have created. Officer Daniel Carter stood a few feet away, maintaining a posture of authority that was both routine and practiced, his attention fixed on her hands as she slowly reached inside her purse. The cashier, still visibly unsettled, pointed once more toward the receipt machine as if repetition could strengthen certainty. Angela remained composed, her movements unhurried, but there was a quiet shift in her focus, as if she was no longer simply responding to a misunderstanding but evaluating the entire structure of how quickly that misunderstanding had formed. When she finally withdrew her identification, she did not hand it over immediately. Instead, she paused, holding it at chest level, allowing the moment to settle in a way that felt almost deliberate. Carter extended his hand slightly, expecting a standard driver's license, something that would either confirm suspicion or resolve it quickly. But what Angela presented did not immediately align with the assumptions already built in the room. The officer's expression tightened subtly as he reviewed the card, his eyes moving between the name, the credentials, and then back to her face, recalculating without saying a word. The atmosphere inside the store shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that made every observer more aware of their own silence. The cashier leaned forward, trying to see what was written, while a customer near the entrance lowered their phone slightly, uncertain whether they were witnessing something ordinary or something that had suddenly become far more complicated than expected. Angela finally spoke again, her tone steady, explaining calmly that there must have been a scanning or payment processing error and that she was willing to resolve it immediately. Her voice did not carry anger or defensiveness, only precision, as if she was accustomed to situations where clarity had to be rebuilt from misunderstanding. Carter listened, but his posture had changed slightly, less certain than before, his authority now sharing space with hesitation. He asked her to confirm additional details, still following procedure, but the rhythm of the interaction had already altered. What had begun as a straightforward accusation was now unfolding into something none of them had fully prepared for. Outside the store, another patrol unit slowed as it passed, and for a brief moment the glass reflected overlapping images of people watching, waiting, and reassessing. Inside, Angela remained still, her presence no longer framed by suspicion alone, but by something else that was beginning to surface quietly in the reactions around her. The cashier stepped back slightly, now uncertain whether the initial assumption had been correct, while Carter continued reviewing the identification with increasing focus. The realization had not fully landed yet, but it was approaching, building in the small pauses between words, in the way people avoided eye contact, in the way certainty began to dissolve into doubt without anyone openly admitting it. Angela did not move to defend herself further. She simply waited, allowing the truth to finish arriving at its own pace. The moment of uncertainty in the small store deepened as Officer Daniel Carter continued examining the identification card, his eyes moving with increasing attention across every line of text, every seal, every credential that challenged his initial assumption. The cashier stood frozen near the register, hands now lowered, her earlier confidence replaced by visible discomfort as she began to sense that the situation had shifted into something far more serious than a routine dispute over a transaction. Angela Brooks remained still, her posture calm but firm, her presence steady in a way that contrasted sharply with the rising tension around her. She did not interrupt the process, nor did she attempt to accelerate it, instead allowing the verification to unfold at its own pace. Carter took a small step toward the counter, as if distance could help him process what he was reading more clearly, then glanced briefly toward the store's security monitor before returning his attention to the identification. The silence inside the room was no longer casual. It was concentrated, almost heavy, as though every person present was aware that a threshold was being approached. The second officer who had arrived earlier shifted his stance near the entrance, observing Carter's reaction rather than the woman at the center of the interaction. Angela finally placed her identification gently on the counter without being asked, a gesture that suggested both cooperation and finality. Carter exhaled slowly, then asked a few additional confirming questions, his tone now noticeably more measured than before. Angela responded without hesitation, providing details that aligned precisely with what the document already indicated. Each answer reduced the space for doubt, replacing it with a growing awareness that the initial assumption had been incomplete. The cashier stepped back again, her hand briefly touching the edge of the counter for support, as if she needed something physical to steady her thoughts. A customer near the door turned slightly, no longer pretending not to listen. Outside, traffic continued normally, unaware of the quiet transformation taking place inside the store. Carter finally straightened, holding the identification in both hands for a moment longer before speaking in a lower voice, acknowledging that there may have been a misunderstanding. The word itself carried weight, not because it resolved everything, but because it marked the beginning of reversal. Angela's expression did not change, but her eyes reflected a subtle acknowledgement that the situation had moved from accusation toward clarification. The second officer leaned in slightly, reviewing the card himself now, confirming what Carter had already begun to accept. The store remained unusually quiet after the initial correction had been made, but the atmosphere had not fully returned to normal, as if the space itself was still adjusting to what had just occurred. Officer Daniel Carter stood near the counter with a more controlled posture, his attention no longer focused on suspicion, but on procedure and resolution. Angela Brooks remained composed, holding her identification again without urgency, her presence steady and unchanged despite the shift in how she was now being regarded. The cashier continued processing the payment, her hands moving carefully across the register, occasionally glancing at the screen as if verifying not only numbers but the stability of the situation itself. The second officer near the entrance adjusted his position slightly, scanning the area outside before returning his focus inside, confirming that there was no external factor contributing to the earlier confusion. Carter cleared his throat quietly and acknowledged that the matter had escalated from a routine transaction issue into a misunderstanding that required correction. His tone was formal but noticeably more respectful than before, reflecting an awareness that every assumption made earlier had not been supported by verified information. Angela responded with calm acknowledgement, stating that she understood that errors can occur in systems and perception, but emphasizing the importance of resolving such matters accurately and without escalation. Her voice remained steady, neither confrontational nor dismissive, but carrying a quiet authority that naturally influenced the tone of the room. The cashier completed the transaction and offered a brief, careful apology, her words hesitant but sincere, as if she was still processing the rapid change in context. Carter nodded once, accepting the resolution while maintaining professional composure, then briefly reviewed his notes, as if ensuring the incident was properly documented as a misunderstanding rather than an unresolved claim. The second officer stepped closer to Carter and spoke in a low voice, confirming that no further action was required and that the situation was fully de-escalated. Angela placed her identification back into her purse and adjusted her posture slightly, preparing to leave, but not rushing, as if allowing the final impressions of the moment to settle for everyone involved. Carter, after a brief pause, offered a formal statement acknowledging that the interaction had been based on incomplete information and that the issue was now considered resolved. There was no dramatization in his words, only procedural clarity, but the meaning behind them carried weight for everyone present. Angela gave a small nod in response, accepting the resolution without embellishment. As she turned toward the exit, the store felt noticeably different, not because of any physical change, but because of the collective awareness that assumptions had shaped the beginning of the encounter and careful verification had reshaped its outcome. Outside, the daylight appeared unchanged, traffic continuing as before, but inside, the memory of what had occurred lingered in the subtle silence left behind. Carter remained for a moment longer near the counter, then shifted his attention to finalizing the report details, ensuring accuracy in how the event would be recorded. The cashier resumed her position behind the register, now focused entirely on routine tasks, while the second officer prepared to leave. Angela exited the store with calm steps, her presence no longer defined by suspicion or correction, but by the quiet restoration of understanding that followed careful confirmation. The late afternoon light outside the small store had softened into a warm glow, casting long reflections across the pavement as Angela Brooks continued walking away from the entrance with steady, unhurried steps. Behind her, the store doors closed, quietly, marking the end of an interaction that had shifted from uncertainty to clarity within a short but intense window of time. Inside, the atmosphere had returned to routine activity, yet the memory of what had occurred still lingered in subtle ways. Officer Daniel Carter remained near the counter for a few additional moments, reviewing the incident details on his device, ensuring that the report accurately reflected the sequence of events without distortion or assumption. His expression was composed, but there was a reflective quality in his posture, as if mentally revisiting each stage of the interaction to reinforce procedural accuracy. The second officer had already stepped outside, scanning the parking area briefly before returning to his vehicle, signaling that no further follow-up was required on site. The cashier resumed normal operations, assisting the next customer who approached the counter, though her movements were slightly more deliberate than before, suggesting that the earlier encounter had left a lasting impression on her awareness of how quickly misunderstandings can form and dissolve. Outside, Angela paused briefly near the sidewalk, adjusting the strap of her bag and glancing toward the direction she had come from, not in hesitation, but in quiet acknowledgement of the moment she had just moved through. Her demeanor remained unchanged, calm and centered, as she continued forward into the flow of everyday city movement. Carter finally stepped away from the counter and made his way toward the exit, pausing briefly as the door opened and the ambient street noise entered the store. For a moment, he observed Angela from a distance as she continued down the sidewalk, her figure blending naturally into the rhythm of the neighborhood. There was no further exchange between them, only the residual understanding that the situation had been resolved through verification rather than assumption. Carter then turned back inside, completing his administrative task with a final note, ensuring that the record clearly reflected that the initial suspicion had not been supported by confirmed facts and that the matter had concluded without escalation. The second, officer's vehicle pulled away from the curb, leaving the area quiet once again. Angela continued walking until she reached the next intersection, where she paused briefly for the signal to change. The environment around her remained ordinary and unchanged, yet the sequence of events that had just unfolded added a deeper layer of awareness to those who had witnessed it. Inside the store, business resumed its normal pace, customers entering and leaving without interruption, while the cashier processed transactions with renewed focus. Carter finished his documentation and prepared to leave, stepping out into the same light that now felt slightly different only in memory, not in reality. The moment had ended, but its implications remained quietly present in the awareness of those who had been part of it, marking a conclusion defined not by conflict, but by correction and understanding. The evening had settled fully over the neighborhood, bringing a quieter rhythm to the streets as traffic lights cycled steadily and pedestrians moved at an unhurried pace. The small store where the earlier misunderstanding had taken place now appeared entirely ordinary again, its windows reflecting the glow of nearby street lamps. Inside, the cashier had already transitioned into a familiar routine, assisting customers with calm efficiency, though the memory of the earlier situation still influenced her careful attention to detail. Officer Daniel Carter had completed his report and was no longer present at the location, but the formal record of the incident had already been submitted through proper channels, ensuring that the event was documented as a case of mistaken assumption resolved through verification. Angela Brooks continued her walk several blocks away, her pace steady and composed as she moved through familiar city streets that now felt unchanged yet subtly different in her awareness. She adjusted her focus forward, blending into the flow of evening movement, her presence no longer marked by interruption or scrutiny. In another part of the neighborhood, Carter had returned to his patrol duties, the earlier interaction now part of his professional record and mental review. He remained reflective but composed, recognizing the importance of relying on confirmed information before drawing conclusions in any future encounter. The second officer had already moved on to another assignment, the brief stop at the store no longer relevant to ongoing activity. Life in the area continued without disruption, with storefronts lighting up as evening commerce resumed its natural rhythm. A small group of pedestrians gathered at a crosswalk near where Angela had passed earlier, waiting for the signal to change, unaware of the internal processes that had recently unfolded nearby. The environment itself showed no sign of tension, yet for those directly involved, the sequence of events had reinforced an understanding of how quickly perception and verification can diverge before correction restores balance. Angela eventually reached a bus stop and paused, standing at a comfortable distance from the curb as she checked the arrival schedule posted above the bench. Her expression remained calm and neutral, reflecting no urgency, only the steady continuation of her day. Across the neighborhood, Carter concluded his shift preparations, ensuring that all procedural notes were finalized and stored according to department standards. The earlier situation was now closed within official documentation, leaving no pending actions or follow-up requirements. As night gradually approached, streetlights became more prominent, casting a soft glow across sidewalks and intersections. Angela boarded her bus when it arrived, taking a seat near the window as the vehicle merged into traffic. From that vantage point, she looked outward at the passing streets, now returning fully to the normal rhythm of the city. Carter, in his patrol vehicle elsewhere, continued through assigned routes, his attention focused on routine responsibilities. The city moved forward without pause, each participant returning to their respective path, while the earlier moment of misunderstanding remained only as a resolved record and a quiet reminder of the importance of clarity, verification, and measured response in everyday encounters. The night had fully settled across the city, bringing a cooler stillness to the streets as storefront lights and passing headlights formed steady patterns across the pavement. The earlier incident, now fully resolved in official records, had already faded into the background of routine urban activity, leaving no visible disruption in the flow of everyday life. Angela Brooks remained on her return route home, seated near the window of the bus as it moved through familiar intersections and residential blocks. Her posture was relaxed, her attention occasionally shifting between the passing scenery and the quiet interior of the vehicle, reflecting a return to personal routine after an afternoon that had briefly drawn attention but concluded without escalation. Across town, Officer Daniel Carter continued his patrol duties, moving through assigned streets with the same measured discipline that defined his shift work. His earlier engagement had been fully documented, reviewed, and closed within procedural guidelines, leaving only standard operational focus for the remainder of his night. He occasionally checked his dashboard systems, confirming location updates and scanning for active calls, but nothing required deviation from routine observation. The second officer who had been present earlier was now stationed in another district, continuing unrelated assignments with no connection to the prior event. Within the store where everything had begun, the closing process had been completed, lights dimmed, and doors secured, leaving the interior quiet and still. The cashier had already left for the evening, her shift ending without further interruption, though the memory of the earlier misunderstanding remained a quiet reflection rather than an active concern. On the bus, Angela observed the passing rhythm of streetlights and intersections, her expression neutral and composed, fully disengaged from the earlier moment, except as a completed experience now behind her. The vehicle slowed at several stops, allowing passengers to board and exit in a steady flow, each person absorbed in their own routines and destinations. Carter, moving through a separate part of the city, passed through the same pattern of illuminated streets and quiet intersections, maintaining awareness of surroundings while remaining focused on standard patrol responsibilities. There was no remaining trace of tension or urgency connected to the earlier interaction, only the continuity of a system that had processed, verified, and concluded its response. As the bus approached Angela's stop, she prepared to disembark, standing smoothly and adjusting her belongings with calm efficiency. When the doors opened, she stepped out into the cool night air and paused briefly on the sidewalk, orienting herself before continuing toward her destination. The neighborhood around her was calm, with distant traffic and soft ambient lighting creating a stable, unremarkable environment. Carter completed another circuit of his assigned route, noting no unusual activity, and proceeded onward according to schedule. The city continued its steady rhythm without interruption, each individual returning to their path, each system functioning within normal parameters, and the earlier moment existing only as a resolved entry within procedural memory rather than an active event in the present. The city's night rhythm continued with steady normalcy, yet beneath its calm surface every system remained actively engaged in maintaining order, scheduling, and routine oversight. Angela Brooks had already returned to her residence, her bus ride completed without interruption, and her transition from public space to private environment marked only by the ordinary sequence of movement through familiar streets. Inside her home, she placed her belongings down with measured calm and moved through small evening routines that required no urgency, no reflection on earlier events beyond the natural passing acknowledgement that another day had concluded. Across the city, Officer Daniel Carter completed the final segments of his patrol rotation, his vehicle moving along well-traveled routes illuminated by consistent street lighting and monitored intersections. His focus remained on standard operational awareness, scanning for traffic irregularities and responding to nothing beyond routine conditions. The earlier incident involving Angela Brooks had already been fully archived in departmental records, categorized as a resolved misunderstanding with proper verification procedures completed, leaving no active follow-up requirements or outstanding concerns. In another district, the second officer had already concluded shift responsibilities and transferred to post-duty processing, ensuring all logs and communications were finalized according to standard protocol. Within the broader city infrastructure, emergency dispatch channels remained quiet, receiving only routine calls unrelated to any prior events involving the individuals previously connected to the store interaction. Angela, now fully settled at home, prepared a simple evening meal and checked messages on her phone, her attention divided between personal matters and the gradual winding down of the day. Her demeanor remained steady, reflecting no lingering disruption from earlier encounters, as the structure of her routine reasserted itself in full. Carter, nearing the final portion of his shift, slowed his patrol vehicle at designated checkpoints, confirming status updates through onboard systems and maintaining awareness of surrounding traffic conditions. The environment around him remained consistent and uneventful, with no indicators requiring deviation from assigned routes. As midnight approached, city activity decreased in volume, though not in function, as essential services continued uninterrupted across transportation, security, and infrastructure monitoring. Angela prepared for rest, turning off interior lights and moving through her home with quiet familiarity, fully detached from the earlier moment that had briefly intersected with her day. Carter completed his final patrol loop, submitted end-of-shift confirmations through standard digital reporting systems, and prepared for handoff to the next scheduled rotation. The closure of both their days occurred independently, without overlap or renewed interaction, each returning fully to personal or professional separation. The earlier incident, now entirely processed and finalized within official systems, remained only as structured data within procedural archives, no longer influencing active operations or daily movement within the city. As the night deepened, the urban environment stabilized into its typical overnight rhythm, where routine, structure, and continuity replaced the earlier moment entirely, leaving only the uninterrupted progression of time and the quiet assurance that all necessary processes had been properly completed. The city entered its deepest hours of night, when movement slowed to a near whisper and only essential systems continued their steady, invisible work. Streetlights cast soft pools of illumination across empty sidewalks, and distant vehicles moved like brief reflections across wet pavement before disappearing into intersections beyond view. Angela Brooks was already asleep in her home, her day fully concluded, her environment quiet and undisturbed, her presence no longer connected to any active public setting or external engagement. Her routine had returned completely to normal, marked only by the familiar stillness of a residential space at rest. Across the city, Officer Daniel Carter had already completed his shift and transferred responsibility to the next rotation, his final report submitted through standard departmental channels. His vehicle was secured, his equipment logged, and his attention no longer required for active duty. The earlier event that had briefly intersected with both their paths was no longer present in operational awareness, having been fully processed, categorized, and closed within official systems. Inside the department's central database, the incident existed only as a completed record, time-stamped and archived according to standard procedure, with no follow-up flags or pending actions attached. In the broader urban environment, dispatch centers operated at minimal volume, responding only to unrelated, routine matters that required no coordination with prior cases. Emergency channels remained stable, and no alerts referenced any continuation or escalation connected to the individuals involved in the earlier store interaction. Within residential neighborhoods, lights dimmed one by one as households settled into rest, marking the natural transition of the city into its overnight cycle. Angela's home remained quiet, her phone placed aside, her belongings arranged in familiar order, and her environment reflecting the complete absence of disruption. Carter, now off duty, had returned to personal time, disconnected from operational systems and no longer engaged in monitoring or response activity. The separation between their experiences had become absolute, defined entirely by the structure of time and routine rather than by any continuing link between them. The earlier misunderstanding that had briefly intersected their lives existed only as a concluded administrative matter, without emotional residue in the official record and without operational consequence in ongoing city function. As the night progressed toward early morning hours, transportation schedules shifted to reduced frequency, commercial areas remained closed, and only essential infrastructure maintained steady operation. Angela's rest continued uninterrupted, her day fully resolved within the quiet boundaries of her private space. Carter's shift cycle had ended entirely, replaced by scheduled downtime before his next rotation. The city itself maintained its consistent equilibrium, where every incident that had reached resolution was absorbed into procedural continuity and every individual returned to their separate path without further overlap. Nothing remained active, nothing required attention, and nothing extended beyond its completed state. The final hours of the night passed in calm uniformity, leaving only the steady rhythm of a functioning city moving forward without disruption, memory, or unresolved presence.